Welcome to China University. This is Chimsy, your student advisor. In this podcast, I will not only talk about the many professional, academic, and personal growth opportunities this country has to offer, but also I'll mention some of the major obstacles foreign students encounter while living in China. I'll share my experience, thoughts, and opinions along with some honest advice and genuine encouragement. Today I'm going to talk about loneliness in China. Feeling lonely is definitely something that you will experience at any point in your life, not only as a student and certainly not only in China, but feeling lonely in China as a student involves some other aspects that are worth mentioning. Let's begin with the question, how and why you might feel lonely in China. Number one, you are away from home, meaning that you don't have the company of your family, and if you, like many other foreigners, cannot afford to fly back home during summer and winter vacation, it means you won't be taking part in any of those family dinners, birthday parties, holiday vacation, and all the other celebrations that tend to keep family and friends close to you. This was particularly the case of those students who couldn't go back home due to the COVID-related flight and border restrictions. Or in some cases, students had the chance to go back home, but they chose not to, fearing that they wouldn't be able to come back to China anytime soon. Number two, friends in China come and go. That's a hard pill to swallow, because unlike your home country, in where you probably have childhood friends that you still talk to, people in China are constantly on the move, especially international students, which often choose or are part of short-term programs that last for only one semester or two. After a year or so, the friends that you met when you first came to China will either go to a different city or different country to continue with their studies or work. And even if they're in the same city or province, they might end up attending different schools. And even if they're in the same school, they might belong to a different department and your class schedules don't match. In addition to this, even if you share the same classes with your friends, they might not want to hang out with you all the time. Not because they dislike you, but because they wish to meet new people and expand their social circle. Even though our wish to connect with new people is totally natural, your friends might inadvertently make you feel left out. This feeling of exclusion might be exacerbated even more if you're an introvert and find it difficult to bond with people that you don't know. Number three, even though Chinese people are basically friendly and welcoming, they might not feel the urge to become friends with every foreigner they run into. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is also not a good thing either, since it's easier to interact with Chinese people when you're surrounded by them. And of course, this increases the chances of you building a solid support network of friends that will ask you to hang out proactively. Another factor you have to take into consideration when making friends in China is that language and cultural barriers can prevent you from building deep bonds with people. It's crucial for you to be proficient in one language other than your own, and it would be even better if you are proficient in Mandarin, because although many Chinese speak English, there are also many who don't. And if you want to have meaningful relationships with them, you need to have meaningful conversations. And for that, Mandarin proficiency would come in handy. As you may have noticed, I mentioned that language and cultural barriers can make it hard to connect with people. The language barrier factor is almost self-explanatory, but I can't say the same thing about the cultural barrier. What I mean by cultural barrier is that sometimes people with the same ethnic or religious background would only hang out with each other. For example, Korean students only hanging out with Koreans, Muslim students only hanging out with other Muslims, and so forth. Then again, this is natural human behavior, but if you don't belong to any group in particular, you'll see how there's some sort of cultural barrier, bubble, or force field that will stop you from interacting with this group of people. For instance, let's say that you come from a very small country with a very small population and your mother tongue is a rare dialect that only 4 people can speak in your island. Your English, French, and Chinese proficiency are low, but still, you decide to come to China to study. Obviously, this is an exaggerated example, but you get the point. What I'm trying to say is that if you are this person, on the one hand, you'll find it very hard to communicate with anyone, including your classmates. And in the cafeteria, you'll have to rely on your finger pointing abilities to choose whatever is it that you want to eat, and complement it, of course, with a good old 这个. On the other hand, you might feel more motivated to learn Mandarin, and since it's your only means of communication, you might end up learning the language faster than anyone else in your class, and as a result, you will be able to connect and form bonds with other people faster. I have to admit that when I first came to China, it felt as if it was my first day at kindergarten. I was overly excited about everything in China to such an extent that I would go out of my way to add WeChats and make friends with every Chinese person or foreigner that I would stumble upon, including security guards, street vendors, and McDonald's staff. But don't get me wrong, there's nothing bad about it, essentially, but it makes me cringe a little bit every time I think about it, because when I look back, I can see that some of those people were clearly not interested in making friends with a foreigner or any stranger whatsoever. Which is also fine. It's fine. It's just that I wish I knew earlier, but I guess I myself was fighting loneliness too. Then I talked to some friends about loneliness in China. Most of them seem to have experienced similar feelings, and for those who didn't, they seemed to understand where I was coming from. After all, loneliness shouldn't be so hard to understand, or should it? One would think that loneliness, by definition, is simply sadness because one has no friends or company. But the most enigmatic thing about loneliness is that you can feel lonely even when you are surrounded by friends or people that you know. Do you remember when and where was the last time you felt lonely? I asked the same question to my friends, and some said that they felt lonely in China for the first time 5 to 6 months after arriving. More specifically, during the first winter vacation, when most classmates would fly back home and not many students would be left in the dormitories. But others expressed to have experienced loneliness even when surrounded by people. For example, one friend talked about feeling lonely in class during his freshman and sophomore years. All of his classmates were Chinese and he was the only foreigner in class. His Chinese classmates would respond in a friendly and polite manner whenever he would ask them questions, but as my friend described it, at the end of the day, they had their own lives and we wouldn't talk much after that. This made him lack a sense of belonging and he ended up feeling lonely. Before I move on to the next example, I have to remind people that your East Asian classmates or friends might feel a little shy around people they don't know. If you are scared of making a fool of yourself by initiating a casual talk and trying to hang out or connect with them, please remember that they might be just as terrified as you are or even more. Alright, moving on, the next example will be the stepping stone to get to the part of this episode in where I talk about the toxic coping mechanisms students use to deal with loneliness. Another friend brought to my attention that he and his friends would go to bars and clubs and that they would all end up intoxicated very often. Whenever he felt lonely in his room and his friends couldn't go out with him, he would go alone, hoping that he, quote unquote, would meet some extraordinary people, and to a certain extent I think he succeeded. He would go to the same bars and clubs and see the same people every time, and it was a matter of time before he would become part of the drinking crowd. But for his surprise, in the middle of parties, while surrounded by his now new friends, he would still feel lonely inside. He would describe it as having an epiphany, in where he would look at his surroundings and wonder whether his drinking buddies would still reach out to him if it wasn't for his constant availability to go out drinking every night. According to him, this would bring some strong feelings of sadness that would force him to get out of whatever he was and get in a taxi and go back home. So Even though there are healthy ways to cope with loneliness, based on my experience, students in China often deal with this feeling in extreme and opposite ways. But the common denominator here is that both ways involve the individual engaging in unhealthy behaviors. They either surround themselves with lots of people and engage in unhealthy behaviors, or the total opposite, meaning that while feeling lonely, these students will isolate themselves. They would reduce their outdoor activities to the minimum, and sometimes they would simply not go out at all. They would sometimes overeat, overdrink, oversleep, and they become prone to video game addiction, compulsive online shopping, binge watching, all while in their rooms. This became more evident during the COVID lockdowns all over China when all classes were being held online. But at the same time, I think it's easier to engage in unhealthy coping mechanisms when you are in the privacy of your room and there's no one there to call you out for your erratic behavior. Lastly, there's one more unhealthy way of coping with loneliness that, in my opinion, is very common among students in China, and that is getting into unwanted, toxic, and abusive relationships. When feeling lonely, people's openness to dating increases. I guess that the uncertainty, excitement, and passion of a new relationship has a soothing effect over our minds. But I've noticed that at the beginning of every semester, some students rush to get into relationships that in some cases become a burden. And even though their feelings of loneliness may have faded away, all they wish now is to be alone. Obviously, dating is part of human nature, but you don't want to date someone for the wrong reasons. First, we have to understand that being alone and loneliness can be different and can feel different regardless of how many people are next to you. Second, accept that you are feeling lonely, but also accept that there's nothing wrong with being alone and doing things all by yourself. And I know this sounds like a cliche, but consider becoming friends with yourself before you become friends with anyone else. Learn how to enjoy your own company and find something useful to do with your alone time. For example, whenever I'm in my room all by myself with nothing to do, I try to contact all friends or family members that I haven't talked to in a while. But at the same time, you gotta be a little curious about other people and interact whenever you both have the chance. But for that, you also got to make sure you change your daily routines from time to time. Different activities often involve different people, and different people have the potential of becoming new friends. Third, in order for you to make friends, you will have to say yes to people more often. But don't say yes to engage in unhealthy behaviors such as binge drinking or binge eating, at least not all the time. Fourth, be strategic with your friendships and romantic relationships. Know what type of people you would like to become friends with or who your romantic partner is going to be. You're going to be selective as opposed to hanging out with random people that will add very little value to your life. And of course, you shouldn't date absolutely everyone that comes across you. Fifth and final, don't feel embarrassed for talking about your feelings of loneliness with close friends and family members. The reality is that most of us have experienced it at some point or another, but not many dare to talk about it. If you don't wish to talk about it with family members or friends, consider seeking professional help. After the COVID pandemic, mental health became less of a taboo. This helped normalize going to therapy. And it's always good to hear advice from someone who is not emotionally invested in you. Alright, that's it for today. Next week, I'll be talking about feeling lost in China. Because no matter how much you think you know where you are in life, sometimes you will feel completely lost in this country. That's why I want to share with you some honest advice and genuine encouragement. You can find me on Instagram as China University Podcast, and where I'll keep you posted on the upcoming episodes. This was Chimsy, and I'll see you next week.